December 1944. Somewhere along a frozen Belgian road, a line of weary German prisoners stands under guard. The snow falls thick and silent, muffling the distant thunder of artillery. They watch as a group of American soldiers kneel beside a stack of large olive-drab boxes stamped in black letters. 10-in-1 ration. One of the Germans chuckles, a dry laugh of disbelief. He mutters that Americans even name their food like machines. The others smirk, expecting the usual tins of tasteless paste and cold beans. Then the lids come off. Inside lie sealed tins of meat and eggs, powdered coffee, real sugar, chocolate, cigarettes, even paper napkins and salt. A corporal unfolds a small menu card, reads it aloud and grins. The laughter fades. In the eyes of those captured men, something shifts. A quiet recognition that this enemy fought a different kind of war. A war not just of bullets, but of abundance. And behind that abundance stood a nation whose factories, farms, and railroads never slept. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, armies were not only unprepared for the scale of destruction, they were unprepared for the logistics of feeding millions of men scattered across continents. To a soldier, a rifle and a ration were equally vital. One killed the enemy, the other kept him alive long enough to fight. And yet, in the early years of the conflict, food was often treated as an afterthought, a matter of tradition rather than innovation. The German Wehrmacht began the war with a system born of the previous one. Its Eiserne portion, the iron ration, was a small emergency pack, meat, biscuits, coffee substitute, meant to sustain a soldier for a single day if supply lines broke. Field kitchens followed the divisions, relying heavily on horse-drawn wagons and locally requisitioned food. Germany's military planners believed victory would come quickly, that conquered territories would feed the advancing army, just as they had during the Blitzkrieg in Poland and France. Across the Atlantic, the picture was different. The United States, still neutral in 1939, possessed no modern ration system at all. Its Quartermaster Corps, responsible for feeding the army, was a bureaucratic backwater, accustomed to small peacetime garrisons. Canned beans, flour, salt pork, and coffee were issued in bulk. Soldiers cooked them themselves, often badly. When America entered the war in December 1941, it faced not only the Axis but the monumental question, how do you feed a global army? The first answers were crude but ambitious. The Quartermaster Corps began developing specialized rations. The C ration, a compact canned meal designed for individual use in combat. The K ration, lighter and portable, for paratroopers and frontline soldiers. The B ration, meant for field kitchens. But as the U.S. Army expanded, crossing oceans into deserts, jungles, and frozen mountains, something larger was needed. Commanders complained that soldiers were tired of monotony, that morale was slipping not from fear, but from the taste of the same food day after day. General George C. Marshall understood what others ignored. Morale was logistics. An army that ate well, rested well, and trusted its supply lines would fight longer and harder. In 1942, he ordered a complete overhaul of the Army's subsistence program, a massive effort uniting military planners, nutritionists, industrial scientists, and private companies. This was the beginning of a quiet revolution in warfare, the industrialization of food. Factories in Chicago, New Jersey, and California were retooled not for bullets, but for biscuits and dehydrated eggs. Civilians packed boxes according to precise military formulas. Calories, vitamins, weight, and shelf life. Every gram calculated for endurance and energy. Food scientists experimented with new preservation methods, vacuum sealing, dehydration, and tin coating that could survive the jungles of the Pacific or the snow of Europe. Each discovery fed into a larger design, a system that could nourish 10 men for an entire day anywhere on Earth. Meanwhile, in Europe, the German army's early advantage in discipline and efficiency was slowly turning into a liability. As the war stretched into Russia and North Africa, its reliance on field kitchens and local resources began to fail. Supply convoys were ambushed, farmlands were scorched, and winter froze everything solid. Reports from the Eastern Front told of soldiers boiling horse bones for broth, or trading cigarettes for a piece of bread from civilians. While German troops starved in the cold, American planners were sketching diagrams of meal boxes divided by caloric content. In those diagrams lay a truth that few realized at the time. The next phase of war would be won not only by steel, but by logistics. By 1943, the Quartermaster Corps had tested dozens of prototypes. What they sought was a ration large enough to feed an entire squad, simple to transport, easy to cook, and adaptable to every climate. It would carry the same name stamped on the side of those olive-drab boxes in Belgium, 10-in-1 ration, and its creation would change how the world understood military sustenance, from a burden to a weapon. By early 1943, the United States had entered a phase of the war defined by movement. Convoys stretched across the Atlantic, carrying not only men and weapons but millions of tons of food. Every meal that reached a soldier's hands had traveled through a chain of farms, factories, trains, ships, and trucks, a system so vast that General Eisenhower once called it the greatest supply operation in history. At the heart of that operation lay an idea that seemed simple but was profoundly revolutionary. Feed 10 men for one day, efficiently, nutritionally, and comfortably. That idea became the 10-in-1 ration. Developed by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago, the 10-in-1 was introduced officially in 1943. Its purpose was to supply a complete, balanced day's diet for 10 soldiers, packaged in a single compact box. Each box contained breakfast, dinner, and supper units, organized into sub-packs filled with canned meats, dehydrated soups, powdered drinks, cereal, jam, biscuits, sugar, and cigarettes. It even included non-food essentials, can openers, spoons, toilet paper, and water purification tablets. Everything was planned with scientific precision, not just calories but variety and morale. The rations came in several menu types, Menu 1 through Menu 5, designed to prevent monotony. One day a squad might have baked beans and sausage, another day corned beef hash or pork luncheon meat. There were tins of processed cheese, powdered eggs, dried fruit, and instant coffee, luxuries that to a soldier felt like home. When combined with field stoves or makeshift fires, the meals could resemble a real breakfast or dinner, even in the ruins of a French village. The packaging itself was a triumph of wartime engineering. Each component was sealed in moisture-resistant tins and waxed cartons, ensuring it could survive tropical humidity or Arctic frost. The boxes were light enough to be airdropped and strong enough to be stacked by the thousands in transport ships. This wasn't just food, it was portable civilization. In contrast, the German army system remained rooted in the old world. Its Einmannpackung, the individual combat ration, contained bread substitute, sausage, cheese spread, instant coffee, and occasionally chocolate or cigarettes. It was functional, but it relied heavily on field kitchens and local requisitioning for main meals. As supply lines collapsed and fuel shortages worsened, field kitchens could no longer keep up. Frontline troops often ate whatever they could scavenge, sometimes going for days without a hot meal. Captured German diaries later described their astonishment upon discovering American ration boxes. Many wrote that they had never seen an army feed its men so abundantly, so systematically. To them, the 10-in-1 wasn't just a meal, it was a sign of industrial power they could not match. By mid-1944, production of the 10-in-1 had reached staggering numbers. Factories across the U.S., from Baltimore to Los Angeles, were packing more than 40 million meals a month. Women working in assembly lines sealed tins of fruit cocktail and powdered milk, destined for the front lines in Europe and the Pacific. Each box carried a stamp of American efficiency, designed in laboratories, produced by industry, delivered by logistics. When the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, millions of 10-in-1 rations followed the troops ashore. They were stacked in depots, piled in trucks, dropped by parachute. Even under fire, the flow never stopped. A single Liberty ship could carry more than 40,000 boxes, enough to feed a division for several days. It was this uninterrupted chain of sustenance that allowed the U.S. Army to maintain its relentless pace across France and into Germany. The Wehrmacht, meanwhile, faced a grimly different reality. Its soldiers often fought on half rations. In the East, frozen supplies and partisans cutting rail lines left entire units starving. In the West, Allied air power destroyed bridges and depots faster than they could be rebuilt. Where Americans brewed coffee and ate stew, German troops gnawed on dry bread and tinned horse meat. The difference wasn't just physical, it was psychological. For American soldiers, every warm meal was a reminder that their country stood behind them, vast and unbroken. For the Germans, every empty mess tin was a reminder that theirs was running out of breath. The 10-in-1 ration had become more than a logistical tool. It was a symbol of how modern war had evolved beyond the battlefield into the realm of production, science, and supply. And soon, that symbol would reveal its full power on the front lines, where soldiers discovered that the taste of victory could sometimes come from a tin can. To the American soldier, the 10-in-1 ration was more than food, and it was connection. A link to home that came sealed in tin and cardboard, smelling faintly of coffee, sugar, and machine oil. In foxholes from Normandy to the Ardennes, men huddled around small fires melting snow to make instant coffee. They would open the ration box together, dividing the contents like a ritual. A can of cheese spread went to one man, a chocolate bar to another. The cigarettes were traded or shared, sometimes saved for after combat, a private reward for surviving another day. Each box contained comfort items deliberately chosen to keep spirits high. American planners knew that morale was nutrition for the mind. The inclusion of real coffee, sugar, fruit, and even paper napkins had been no accident. Psychologists and dietitians had been consulted during the design phase. They found that familiar tastes, the sweetness of jam, the smell of coffee, evoked memory, reducing homesickness and fatigue. Soldiers wrote home about it. In letters preserved in the National Archives, one infantryman in Italy described the miracle box that contained everything from oatmeal to matches. Another in France joked that he ate better in the field than back home in Kansas. Behind the humor was truth. American troops were among the best-fed fighting men in history. Even in the chaos of battle, the system held. During the breakout from Normandy, when roads were choked with vehicles and the front advanced faster than planners expected, supply units adapted on the move. Truck drivers, at the so-called Red Ball Express, carried not only fuel and ammunition but endless stacks of 10-in-1 boxes. They drove day and night through shellfire, mud, and fog to keep the front fed. Many soldiers later said that the sound of those trucks arriving was as welcome as the sound of artillery support. In those moments, when a tired platoon opened a box and smelled hot meat and coffee, they felt the full reach of their nation's strength. The 10-in-1 ration was a message disguised as a meal. You are not forgotten. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, German soldiers survived on bread, canned meat, and ersatz coffee made from roasted barley. To them, American abundance was unimaginable. When captured, many would stare silently at the variety of tins in Allied depots: fruit cocktail, pudding, cheese, cocoa, things they hadn't seen since before the war. In the small human spaces of war, in mess tins, campfires, and tired smiles, the contrast between two worlds became undeniable. Logistics has no glory. It doesn't thunder like tanks or roar like bombers, but it wins wars quietly, mile by mile, meal by meal. The 10-in-1 ration represented the perfection of logistical thinking. It was built not just to nourish, but to move. Its dimensions were standardized to fit in cargo holds, stacked neatly on pallets, loaded into trucks and aircraft without wasting an inch of space. Every component, from can weight to cardboard thickness, was calculated for transport efficiency. In combat zones, that design translated into speed. A single supply truck could deliver enough food for hundreds of men, without the need for repacking or cooking facilities. Field units could eat within minutes of halting. No waiting for field kitchens, no dependence on local food sources, which in Europe were often destroyed or contaminated. The rations modular system also simplified command logistics. Platoon leaders could issue food by squad rather than individual, cutting administrative time. In amphibious operations, this efficiency became crucial. During the Normandy landings, rations had to survive seawater, sand, and rough handling. The 10-in-1's wax-coated boxes did just that, floating briefly before sinking, often still watertight when recovered. Engineers later noted that the boxes could be dropped from low-flying aircraft without breaking open, allowing rapid resupply to isolated units. Nutrition science also played a tactical role. Each man received approximately 4,500 calories per day, enough to maintain strength under combat stress. Meals were balanced for protein, fat, and carbohydrate ratios based on research from the Army Medical Department. This kept soldiers alert, reduced fatigue, and prevented malnutrition even after weeks in the field. German field reports, intercepted later in the war, mentioned with envy the Americans' mechanical efficiency and supply. Where the Wehrmacht needed horses and field cooks, the Americans needed trucks and boxes. This difference became decisive as the front expanded. A well-fed soldier could march longer, think clearer, and fight harder. And when multiplied by millions, that advantage turned into momentum, a momentum that carried the Allies from the beaches of France to the Rhine. Every unopened ration box waiting on a dock was, in essence, a promise that when the next dawn came, the men at the front would still have strength in their hands and warmth in their stomachs. That quiet power, the power of preparation and precision, was what made the 10-in-1 not just a ration, but a weapon. And yet the story of this weapon wasn't only about American ingenuity. It was also about how the enemy saw it, and what it revealed to them about the world they were losing. Behind every 10-in-1 box stood an empire of production. From Midwestern farms to coastal factories, the United States had become a single coordinated machine, a nation organized for feeding its army and the world. By 1944, more than 11,000 American companies were involved in food supply contracts for the military. Meat from Chicago stockyards, fruit from California, wheat from Kansas, all converged into assembly lines that never stopped. Factories once making candy and cereal now packed dehydrated soups and powdered milk. Women known as victory workers filled tins, sealed boxes, and stacked crates bearing stenciled labels. 10-in-1 U.S. Army. It was the industrial miracle of scale. Each box required the cooperation of dozens of sectors: agriculture, transportation, packaging, nutrition science, and military logistics. Railcars carried the finished rations to ports where cranes loaded them onto Liberty ships bound for Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. In warehouses near Liverpool or Naples, the boxes were resorted, assigned to units, and trucked forward through a system of depots that spanned thousands of miles. To the Germans, this logistical web appeared almost supernatural. While their own army struggled to transport ammunition, the Americans seemed able to deliver fresh food to any front, no matter how chaotic. Captured documents from the Wehrmacht's Quartermaster General in late 1944 described the Allied supply system as limitless and mathematical. They noted with disbelief that even isolated units reported receiving hot meals during active operations. This capacity stemmed from more than wealth. It came from planning, the American doctrine of logistics as strategy. Every operation, from D-Day to the crossing of the Rhine, began not with tactics, but with calculations, tonnage, shipping capacity, and daily caloric needs per division. The 10-in-1 box was a unit of measurement as much as a meal. Generals could plan offensives knowing exactly how much food would be required per day of advance. In the language of war, this was control. Control of energy, movement, and morale. While German soldiers searched cellars for bread, the Americans built mountains of organized sustenance, the quiet infrastructure of victory. For the German soldier, the American ration was an object of fascination and humiliation. As the Allies advanced through France and the Low Countries, abandoned depots and captured supply trucks often fell into German hands. When they opened the boxes, they found a world inside that seemed to mock their hardship. There were cans of fruit cocktail, cocoa, and puddings labeled dessert army issue. Inside one lid, a neatly printed instruction card explained how to heat the meal and make coffee from a powder packet. To men who had spent months subsisting on black bread and ersatz margarine, such order and comfort felt unreal. Many German prisoners later told Allied interrogators that they had underestimated the Americans, believing them soft, untested, dependent on luxury. But seeing those ration boxes, efficient, plentiful, and uniform, changed their view. This was not softness. It was organization at a scale they could not comprehend. A Wehrmacht officer captured in Normandy remarked during questioning, "When an army eats like this in the field, you know it cannot be defeated." German intelligence also analyzed the 10-in-1 reports. From the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, in Beisten, 1944 described the American system in meticulous detail, concluding that the industrialized preparation of nutrition was a decisive advantage. They understood that such abundance required not only factories but shipping lanes unbroken by blockade, something Germany no longer possessed. Even propaganda could not disguise the envy. While German newsreels still showed images of heroic endurance, soldiers at the front whispered about the captured tins that tasted of peaches and cream. The contrast was painful, one side fighting hunger, the other feeding comfort into its war machine. In war, food becomes more than sustenance. It becomes a measure of civilization. The American 10-in-1 embodied a worldview that soldiers were human beings whose physical and emotional well-being mattered. Every calorie, every grain of sugar reflected the belief that life, even amid destruction, deserved care and consistency. Germany's system, by contrast, mirrored its ideology: austere, hierarchical, and expendable. Rations were functional, stripped of comfort. Individual soldiers were cogs in a larger machine, expected to endure rather than to be sustained. When supply collapsed, they were told to improvise, to take from the land, to survive as conquerors, an approach that crumbled when the conquered lands themselves were ruined. The 10-in-1 symbolized something entirely different: the idea that strength comes from preservation, not deprivation. It was a philosophy encoded in tin and paper. Every box that reached the front line carried within it the care of distant workers, the science of nutritionists, and the faith of planners who believed victory could be engineered. When German soldiers laughed at the label, they saw only a number, 10-in-1. When they looked inside, they saw what that number truly meant: a world capable of feeding millions without breaking. In that revelation was the moral edge of the Allied war effort, the power to sustain, not just destroy. The war would still rage on in forests, cities, and skies, but from that moment on, the balance of endurance had shifted irreversibly. The 10-in-1 box had proven that in modern war, the mightiest weapon might be the one that feeds you. And as both armies pushed toward the heart of Europe, that truth would soon play out in the bitterest winter of the conflict, when logistics, hunger, and willpower collided on a frozen front. The real turning point came not from the rations themselves, but from what they symbolized. By 1944, the German army was stretched thin across collapsing fronts. Food shipments from the Reich were inconsistent, sabotage on rail lines was constant, and the vaunted Wehrmacht supply chain, once the pride of its lightning campaigns, had fractured. On the Western Front, German soldiers scavenged potatoes from abandoned French farms, traded cigarettes for bread, or slaughtered local livestock when command wasn't watching. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced with the steady rhythm of logistics that seemed almost supernatural. In France, the Red Ball Express, a massive convoy network of over 6,000 trucks, ran day and night, carrying ammunition, fuel, and yes, food, directly from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. The 10-in-1 boxes, neatly packed in olive-drab cartons, rolled off those trucks like clockwork. A single truck could feed hundreds. A single convoy could feed divisions. Every time the German front collapsed another few kilometers, another stream of these boxes followed close behind. A quiet tide of industrial might that didn't just feed soldiers. It powered an army's confidence. By contrast, German field kitchens were falling apart. In Ardennes during Winter 44, captured German diaries tell the story. "The men are hungry," one soldier wrote. "We melt snow to make soup, but we have nothing to put in it." Another wrote bitterly, "The Americans eat chocolate and throw the wrappers into the snow. We collect them just to smell." Then came the Battle of the Bulge. Cold, hungry, and desperate, many German units survived on captured rations. The irony was brutal. They fought to destroy the same army whose food now kept them alive. A veteran from the 2nd Panzer Division later recalled, "We opened one of their big boxes. Inside was meat, butter, coffee, and even sweets. We hadn't seen anything like it since the war began. It felt like opening a piece of America itself." American soldiers, on the other hand, never went without. Every foxhole had its ration box, compact, efficient, sealed against the elements. Some soldiers used the cans as makeshift heaters. Others traded the surplus coffee or chocolate with civilians, spreading not just sustenance but goodwill. The 10-in-1 wasn't just a meal. It was a message. It said, "We have more than enough. We can feed an army an ocean away, and we're not stopping." When the war finally began turning decisively in 1945, food was as much a weapon as the rifle or tank. The Americans had proven that total war was fought not only with bullets but with calories, fuel, and planning. Captured German officers, debriefed after surrender, often mentioned logistics with awe. One admitted bluntly, "You Americans fight with your stomach full, and that is why you never stop." The 10-in-1 ration was more than a box. It was a symbol of a nation's industrial power, its respect for its soldiers, and its ability to turn mass production into a tactical advantage. As American columns rolled deeper into Germany, those olive boxes were everywhere, stacked in depots, piled on trucks scattered across ruined villages, and whenever German civilians came across one, they too stared in disbelief at its contents. Sugar, coffee, butter, luxuries long vanished from German shelves, lay inside a single army ration box. The laughter that once mocked American food had long since vanished. In its place stood a realization, one that came too late. The war of machines could be lost in factories, but the war of endurance was lost in the stomach. And America's soldiers, fed and relentless, were proof of that. The front lines of Europe were now collapsing under not just bombs and tanks, but under the quiet power of supply chains that never broke. The same cardboard box that once drew laughter now represented the end of the Reich's illusion of superiority. The 10-in-1 box had become the quiet drumbeat of Allied victory, and with every opened can, every steaming cup of coffee in a ruined farmhouse, the balance of the war tilted further toward the inevitable. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, cities reduced to ash, armies broken, nations starved. Yet amid the desolation, one truth stood clear to every soldier who had survived the long march across continents. The American army had never gone hungry. From the beaches of Normandy to the shattered streets of Berlin, the steady rhythm of supply had been unbroken. The same 10-in-1 boxes that once provoked German laughter had now fed an army that crossed oceans, rivers, and borders without pause. The aftermath of this logistical triumph rippled far beyond the battlefield. Historians and military planners studying the war soon recognized that the United States had redefined the art of warfare. It was not merely about courage or numbers anymore. It was about coordination, foresight, and the ability to sustain a fighting force thousands of miles from home. In reports from the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, the scale was staggering. By war's end, over 100 million 10-in-1 ration boxes had been produced. Each box, designed to feed 10 men for one day, represented a miniature victory of planning, precision, and industry. Factories across the American Midwest worked around the clock, employing men and women alike. Canneries in Illinois, packaging plants in New York, and bakeries in Pennsylvania all played their part. Every sandwich spread, every packet of coffee, every tin of meat was a piece of a vast humming network that made the 10-in-1 possible. And for soldiers returning home, those boxes became an emblem of their service, a quiet memory of the meals that kept them going through the mud, the cold, and the fear. Captured German officers, interviewed in Allied camps, often mentioned the same thought with reluctant respect. "You Americans," one said, "fed your army like kings. We fed ours like prisoners." But beyond the tactical advantage, there was something deeper, psychological. American soldiers felt cared for. The consistent supply of food, even in dire conditions, reinforced morale. It told every man in uniform that his government hadn't forgotten him, that somewhere across the ocean, millions were working to ensure he would eat. This bond of trust between the home front and the front line became one of America's quietest but most powerful weapons. In contrast, post-war analyses of the German military exposed how hunger had corroded its strength from within. By 1944, ration cuts were severe. Meat portions had dropped to fractions of pre-war standards. Ersatz coffee, a bitter brew made from roasted barley or acorns, replaced the real thing. Frontline troops often looted civilian stores or relied on captured Allied supplies to survive. And when the Wehrmacht finally broke, hunger followed them into captivity. Allied prisoner of war camps recorded the same desperate behavior. German soldiers searching through garbage pits for leftover American food cans, still amazed at their quality. The 10-in-1 ration had done more than feed an army. It had sustained momentum. It proved that modern warfare was not won by the boldest charge, but by the army that could endure, day after day, meal after meal. Even after the war, the lessons of the 10-in-1 box endured. Military institutions around the world studied its design, compact, balanced, nutritionally complete. Britain's post-war composite rations and even early NATO supply models drew heavily from the American blueprint. The idea was simple, but revolutionary. Feed men well, and they fight well. Feed them consistently, and they win. The soldiers who once mocked American rations had vanished into history, but the box they mocked lived on, as a quiet monument to the most overlooked weapon of World War II. Logistics. The shadow of hunger that haunted Europe would linger for years. But the world had now seen what industrial abundance could achieve. The 10-in-1 had fed not just victory, but a vision of post-war order built on supply, structure, and system. And yet, beyond the statistics and strategy, there remained a human story, of soldiers, of hunger, of survival. The war was over, but the taste of those rations would stay with them for a lifetime. As the war's smoke cleared and the world began rebuilding, the story of the 10-in-1 box continued, not as a forgotten military artifact, but as the blueprint for how modern armies would feed their soldiers for generations to come. When American soldiers returned home, many carried memories of those olive-drab boxes more vividly than the weapons they fired. To them, the 10-in-1 was a symbol of reliability, a small, consistent comfort in a world that had been anything but. In letters and interviews decades later, veterans often described how that one dependable meal, hot coffee brewed from powdered grounds, biscuits warmed over a small flame, and tinned meat eaten under the open sky, gave them the strength to keep moving. But its legacy reached far beyond nostalgia. In 1946, as the U.S. military assessed the logistical lessons of World War II, the Quartermaster Corps began developing a new generation of ration, the RATION, Combat Individual C-Ration, and later the Meal, Combat Individual MCI, both directly evolved from the concepts tested through the 10-in-1. The idea was clear: combine industrial efficiency with nutritional precision, making each soldier a self-sustaining unit in the field. The success of the 10-in-1 had proven something profound, that America's ability to nourish its soldiers was inseparable from its ability to win wars. The Cold War military planners knew this well. As the Korean conflict erupted in 1950, those same principles were deployed again: modular rations, long shelf life, easy transport, mass production. Even NATO allies adapted the model. British, Canadian, and French forces studied the American design closely, noting how the 10-in-1 had been more than food, it was a morale system. Inside every box had been not just calories, but carefully planned psychology. There was variety. Multiple menus rotated to avoid monotony. There was balance. Each meal group had proteins, carbohydrates, sugars, and stimulants like coffee or chocolate. And above all, there was humanity. The reminder that every man eating in the mud of Normandy or the jungles of the Pacific was still being fed like a human being, not a machine. German soldiers in post-war interviews often reflected on this contrast. One Wehrmacht veteran captured during the Ardennes offensive described it simply: "Our rations came from desperation. Theirs came from science." This difference between scarcity and strategy had changed the course of modern warfare. The 10-in-1 was a small detail in a massive war, yet it represented the philosophy that powered the Allied victory: organization wins wars. When the Marshall Plan began to rebuild Europe, American surplus food became the first step toward recovery. Powdered milk, canned meat, and packaged goods, all products of the same supply chains that once fed soldiers, now fed civilians. The system that had nourished armies now nourished nations. In Germany itself, the irony was undeniable. In 1946 and 1947, U.S. relief shipments used much of the same food technology and packaging methods developed during the war. The same foreign food once mocked by Wehrmacht soldiers was now saving their people from starvation. In the harsh winters of post-war Europe, from laughter to survival, the circle had closed. By the 1950s. The 10-in-1 had vanished from military warehouses. replaced by more advanced rations, but its influence lived on in every mess kit, every field meal, and every logistical doctrine. And yet, its story wasn't one of food alone. It was the story of how a nation that understood planning could defeat one that relied on improvisation. Of how every box, stamped with an American eagle and filled with food, carried a message of endurance louder than any battlefield speech. Today, historians looking back at the U.S. Army's wartime success often trace its roots not to a single general or weapon, but to its mastery of logistics. And standing quietly within that story, the 10-in-1 ration remains a symbol of that mastery. Unglamorous, uncelebrated yet indispensable. For every soldier it fed, it represented one more step toward victory. For every German who saw its contents, it revealed a truth their leaders had denied. The war wasn't only about who fought harder, but who planned smarter. And for history, it remains a reminder that even in the most brutal wars, the smallest box can carry the biggest meaning. In the grand story of World War II, much is said about tanks, planes, and battles, the roar of engines, the clash of armies, the maps that changed overnight. But history often forgets the quiet victories, the invisible forces that sustained them. The American 10-in-1 ration was one of those silent victors. It didn't fire bullets. It didn't capture cities. Yet it fed the men who did. And in doing so, it changed the rhythm of modern war. Each box that crossed the Atlantic was a testament to something deeper than military power. It was the product of millions of hands, factory workers, farmers, packers, engineers, all united by a single purpose: to keep soldiers alive and strong in a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. When German soldiers once laughed at the sight of American rations, they couldn't have known they were laughing at the embodiment of an idea. That victory was not born from arrogance or ideology, but from care, coordination, and discipline. The 10-in-1 box represented the kind of strength that doesn't shout, the strength that builds, sustains, and endures. It carried not just food but reassurance, that even far from home, in a frozen trench or a burning city, a soldier would never be forgotten. That simple act of feeding men with dignity reshaped the psychology of warfare. It reminded the world that even amidst destruction, humanity could still exist, in a warm meal, a shared chocolate bar, or a cup of coffee brewed under falling shells. When the war ended, those olive boxes disappeared, but their lesson endured. Every modern army that marches today still carries within its logistics the echo of that design. Efficient, compassionate, precise, wars may be fought by weapons, but they are won by systems and by the quiet order behind the chaos. And somewhere, in the archives of history, the 10-in-1 ration remains a small, cardboard monument to that truth. A reminder that sometimes the real power of a nation lies not in what it destroys, but in what it provides.